I'm going to talk a little bit about sales organization strategies and tactics. This is purely my opinion based on 20, almost 30 years of leading salespeople in a variety of different industries, last 15 being in the medical space. So I'm going to start with sort of like what are the two big broad questions you have to ask yourself as you start down this path, and that is, are we going to do this in-house or are we going to outsource that functionality? If you're going to do it in-house, the first and foremost thing you need is an organizational sales leader. You need a me. You need somebody that wakes up every day and thinks about sales, thinks about the way the product's going to be presented to the customers, and how you're going to generate revenue. The choices inside of that would be then, are we going to have a direct sales force? Are we going to have an independent sales force? And I put down 1099 that also could be a strategic partner. I'll talk about that in a minute. Or you're going to have a hybrid, a blend of the two. The second potential avenue you could go would be an outsourced sales department. If you decide to outsource your sales department, you still need an organizational sales leader, but you don't necessarily need a me, but you need a me-like substance. You need somebody inside the organization that is going to think about sales. And it may not be a sales professional, it may be somebody else. It could be the CEO, it could be the COO, it could be anybody within the organization, but somebody's got to own that process. Because even though you outsource it, trust me when I tell you that that outsourced organization is going to need a liaison back in, they're going to need to be held accountable for the results, and so somebody in your organization needs to own that. Okay. So what are the kind of the pros and cons of both options? Well, in-house, you have direct control over the sales activity. When I say lower cost, I'm not comparing it to an independent sales force. I'm comparing it to an outsourced direct sales force. And you can ensure that all the reps have sort of a standardized training, experience, call focus, and the like, because you're owning the process. What are the disadvantages of that? It can take a long time to deploy. Finding the right salesperson is not an easy task. I just recently, we received a capitalization for growth back in November, and I had to deploy 15 direct salespeople. Let me tell you, that was quite a task. And it also can be difficult to manage large numbers without a pretty robust sales infrastructure. If you outsource this function, the pros are you can quickly deploy a fairly large sales team covering a wide geographic area. That's what they do. It doesn't require an executive team to possess be a sales professional. You can do that without a me. You can do that with somebody who's just connected to the organization. And it can position your firm for an early exit if you're partnering with a strategic. I think most startups kind of look to that kind of first and foremost as the best option. If I can take my product and drop it into a J&J or a Medtronic or anybody else's bag, and strategically partner with them, then you sort of set the stage, if you will, for an exit much earlier than otherwise you might be able to achieve. The cons, they can be very expensive. When you look at outsourcing, purely outsourcing, not strategic partnering, I will tell you those are really expensive dates. I've looked into those, and whatever cost structure you think you have internally, multiply it, because you've got an additional layer of infrastructure you have to pay for, the other firm. And also, and this is something to remember, you are at the mercy of another company for your revenue growth. If you are in the commercialization phase, meaning you've moved past sort of the IP and you've actually started producing something and selling something, how you will be evaluated for an exit changes. If you are purely in the IP, you're purely in the process of intellectual property and you've come up with a great idea and you're trying to sell it off, if you will, or get someone to purchase it, you're being evaluated on your potential. What could you do? And so you're looking at the potential markets and how big they are, what type of share of wallet you can achieve. But once you sell your first product, guess what you're evaluated on? Actual results. They don't care about potential anymore. How much did you sell? How effective are your salespeople? What is your conversion rate? How long is your sales cycle? So the day that you drop your product into the marketplace and someone buys it, the entire valuation for a potential exit just changed. So know that in advance. And if you outsource, you're now at the mercy of a third party's interest level. You're at the mercy of their compensation plan. You're at the mercy of their training program. You're at the mercy of the salesperson's interest. And you better hope that they're aligned with yours. First and foremost, you have to identify the rep qualifications and kind of what's needed. And this, I believe, resides around what are you selling? Okay, so as I said earlier on the panel, to me there are two basic questions that you have to, or problems, that one of which you need to solve. In perfect world, you're solving both. You're improving patient outcomes and taking cost out. But for most of us, I think I think it's fair to say you usually solve one or the other. in a big way. Now, in the case of my company, we like to claim that we solve the economic problem. The reality of it is we really are solving the patient outcome situation first and foremost, and then have some soft benefits on the economic side. But I believe that if you are selling better patient outcomes, then a direct sales force is the route to go. And you need to have somebody that has strong OR experience, strong clinical knowledge, and they must possess immediate physician access to the targeted customer. This is critical in today's world. It is critical because those walls get higher and higher and higher every single day. And so you have to have somebody that has the ability to make a phone call, drop an email, and have that surgeon respond to it. The cold call is a tough road to go. Trust me. And I think in this world you want a challenger personality. And I want to make sure that people understand when I say challenger, I'm not talking about somebody that's going to be argumentative. I'm talking about somebody that is willing to take a very highly educated individual, in our case a surgeon, it could be any other person within a hospital, and challenge what they are doing to do it a different and a better way. That takes a lot of guts and it takes a lot of courage because you're talking to somebody in most cases that has vastly more education than you do, and you're trying to tell them to change what they do to a different way. So I think you need a certain personality type that's equipped for that and can do it in a way that is not perceived as offensive or obtrusive. On the other hand, if you are selling a cost savings, you need somebody that has the ability to negotiate, can understand the dynamics of a hospital and where all the constituency groups are, has strong reporting and administrative skills, and can be a little bit less experienced here and a little bit less expensive here. But they better be a hard worker. They better be somebody, and that's one of the types that are identified in sales. Everybody likes to think they're hard workers, but in this case, that's a type of salesperson. So this is somebody that's banging on doors every day, is out there calling, in sheer volume is hitting people. So in this world, if you're selling an economic benefit, I think that type of a salesperson is highly effective. So your sales structure direct, what are the pros? Well, you have maximum control over the process. You have maximum control over the call focus, the messaging. You have the best chance for handling hospital VAC process, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. You have a very strong voice of the customer loop, what's really important to them, and it's the fastest path to increase sales. What are the cons? It's expensive. It requires sales manager infrastructure. So again, if you're commercializing with a light financial footprint, this is a tough road to go. When to utilize it, in my opinion, always, if you can afford it. If you can afford it, it is the best way to go if you're not partnering already with a strategic buyer. When to avoid it, obviously if money's unavailable or if the partnership with a strategic partner is available. But as I said earlier, just be careful. It's not always utopia. All right, independents, which can either be 1099s or strategics. What's the pros? They're the least expensive path to revenue. The cons, however, are you have little to no control over the actual sales call, minimal voice of the customer feedback loop, and little interest in pre-revenue VAC work, which can be difficult to engage and motivate. In today's world, and I was spoken to Vijay in the break, today's world you have a value analysis committee that's going to evaluate every product that goes into a hospital. There is a change that I'm seeing this year, which is the VACs are actually having two bites of the apple. They're actually conducting a pre-VAC, or a pre-trial VAC, where a surgeon has to go through the VAC process to have your product identified before it can even be trialed. Then once it's trialed, a second bite at the apple to go through the VAC, go through the value analysis committee. It is very difficult to get an independent to do that at no payment, because this is all pre-revenue work. There is no commission associated with this, and with a long life cycle to get to revenue, it's sometimes very difficult to engage 1099s. So it is a challenge. This is one of the biggest changes in the commercialization landscape over the last 10 or 15 years, in my opinion, has been the rise in power of the value analysis committees in the hospitals and the change in how we have to commercialize our product. 15 years ago, 1099s were the way to go. Almost in every case, if you were picking a product to market, because they were such a nice, inexpensive way to get your product exposed to everybody. But the problem today is with all this pre-revenue work, you almost have to put them on the payroll in some fashion, make them a direct employee on some level to really engage them in the process. Because guess what? You're not an anchor product any 1099 day one. You're not. They've got a bag of stuff they're taking into that physician, and you're not an anchor product because you haven't even been approved for purchase yet. So if they're sitting in front of a physician and they've got limited time with them, do you think they're bringing out your product that they can't even sell yet? Not very often. So that's why it's changing. This landscape is changing where once was a very, very viable and almost preferred option. It is changing very rapidly into one that is very difficult to execute for startup companies. I offer this. I seriously wonder if the small independent 1099 is going to be around in 5 years due to the rise of the VAC. I really do. Large independent organizations, I still think will be there because they're going to absolutely be needed. But that 1- and 2-man band that are out there everywhere, usually it's an ex-direct that took his Rolodex, I'll date myself, their Outlook file, and use those relationships and that access to surgeons. That used to be a real viable business, but it's not so much anymore. I'll tell you a quick funny story. Years ago, I was at a conference and Tom Peters was speaking. And he was funny because he told the story. He said, I got invited years ago. He said, you tell the story at these conferences where he said, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. Next year, one of you won't be here. It's kind of like the standard joke in business. He said, I got invited to speak at the Travel Agents Association, and this is like at the dawn of the internet when things were really taking off. And he said, I had to change it slightly. He said, look to the left of you, look to the right of you, none of you will be here next year. He said, you work in an industry that is rapidly being phased out by the internet. And so, things change, and I really think that over the next 5 years, that small, independent 1099 is going to have a real tough go of it because what they sell, which is relationships, becomes less valuable in an environment where again, clinical outcomes and cost savings are a far higher voice inside the hospital. Hybrids, that's a blend of both. That's when you have both directs and indirects working for you. They can backfill an open direct territory. So if you put a direct employee, for example, in New York or Los Angeles, you could put an indirect in Sacramento or Buffalo. In Utopia, they work together. In Utopia, the direct and the indirect are working hand in hand and singing Kumbaya and achieving wonderful things. That's Utopia. However, none of us really work in Utopia, and in reality, what ends up happening is the world looks a little bit different. What you would hope is that in a hybrid environment, the 1099 would provide the relationships and the access to your customer, and your direct would be the subject matter expert, the pro from Dover that would come in and close the deal, and the two of them would share commission and walk out to conquer the next hill. Unfortunately, what you tend to see is that the independent is terrified of the direct, thinking they're going to leverage my relationships and then supplant me and kick me out. And the direct is definitely terrified of the independent, saying that they're a much cheaper channel, so if they get them ensconced, they're going to get rid of me. So it's really hard to get those two groups to work together because they are terrified of each other being potential replacement for each other. The other issue is there's a lot of time spent in vetting and finding 1099s. Is it a right call point? Are you a right fit with them? Are they already calling on your customer group? So, while it's a small knit, it's nevertheless there because as I say, and I've started up 4 companies now and been successful in all 4, the one resource that is the most precious for a startup company other than money is time. It's time. You cannot replace it. Matter of fact, in some ways, it's more important than money because money you can replace. You can find other investors, but you cannot replace time. And if you're spending that time chasing something that may not pay fruition, you can't get it back. So when to utilize this, in my opinion, always if you can, and you have available time and bandwidth. And when to avoid it, and that would be if your sales management's time is so hyper-focused on bringing up a direct team, you don't want to distract them. You just leave those opportunities, if you will, for a later day. Selection process, and I want to emphasize this one, real important for hiring, whether it's direct or indirect, is that you need to identify very clearly the background and the qualifications that you need from your potential employees or representatives and stick to it. Do not make exceptions. Because you know why? Salespeople are pretty darn good at convincing people to do things, and that's, so you can get convinced going, yeah, I know this guy didn't exactly have what we want, but wow, I got to have him, because they're good at salespeople. So they sold you on basically deviating from your process. At Checkpoint, what we identified was you really had to have 3 major components to come on board with us. 1, we wanted 5 to 10 years of direct sales experience in the surgical call points that we identify, and it would be in the market that you're interviewing in, and it would be really great if you worked for a startup in the past. Why? Because a startup environment is different than working for one of the big boys. It just is. And so you want them to sort of have gone through that in the past. I did an analysis about 6 months ago, right before we launched this big wave of hiring that we just went through, and I looked at everybody that I had to terminate over the past 3 years, and guess what? 100% of them, with the exception of one guy, did not qualify by my own qualifications. I got talked into deviating, or somebody else did, and so I looked at it and went, well, yep, no wonder, yep, no wonder. So I am a real stickler about the fact that once you identify what you need, stick to it. I would also strongly recommend an independent outsourced evaluation company, a computer-based automated evaluation of salespeople characteristics. They're relatively inexpensive. I pay $2,000 right now per year for unlimited use of an application, and I think they're just incredibly valuable. What I did when I selected the firm we went with is I vetted it against me. I know me really well, warts and all. And I looked at it, when I got the report, I said, yep, that's me. And then I then tested the other people in our organization that I had a pretty good idea of, and went, yep, that's Charlie, yep, that's Lisa, yep, that's so-and-so. And I said, that's them. So it gives you one more tool. It's not a be-all, end-all, but in the selection process, it gives you one more avenue, because, I always find it funny when people tell me, oh, you can trick those. I've never seen it yet. I've never done one on somebody I knew that I didn't come away with a report that said, yep, that's them. Most importantly, I've never done one on myself that I didn't come away with going, yep, that's me. Lastly, I'm not an attorney, but I would strongly recommend you put everything in writing. I would get the candidate to agree to terms, and I would do a pre-employment background check on anyone you hired as a direct. You're going to need it anyways for credentialing, but it's just one last way of making sure that you don't make a bad selection process. Training is critically important to the onboarding of anybody, whether it's an independent or a direct. And they really need to have 4 things, in my opinion, when they go out and represent your product, knowing that they're going to get better over time. They need to have clinical knowledge. How does your product interface with the patient and the surgeon? They need to have product knowledge. How is your product different than any other product that's in the marketplace that you're replacing? They need to have industry knowledge. What and how and where is this going to be utilized? What's the history? What biases or predispositions are you going to be overcoming? And they need to have a strong elevator pitch. I cannot stress that point enough. If you've ever sold to anyone in the hospital, and I agree, by the way, that there are no, people say you sell to hospitals, that's brick. Tough to sell to bricks. You're selling to people. Most hospital people are like this when you're talking to them. They're like, they're on the move, and you're, hey, you got a second, got a second, got a second? You're trying to chase them down, and you better be compelling and interesting in about 30 seconds. Because if you don't, then they're like, oh, I got to go. So you have to have a real fast, very cogent, very, very well-articulated elevator pitch. If it requires 10 minutes of uninvited attention on the part of your customer to get your point across, you're dead, because you'll never get it. So have that really quick, because it's almost like a fishing, just that nibble. You want them to be interested enough to give you that time later. But you're going to have to learn to be really good, really fast. So one of the things we do in ours is we do role play, role play, role play, role play with everybody on the elevator pitch. Quick, it's a head and neck surgeon. You're showing they have a thyroid procedure. What are you going to say to them? And we want them to get our people real fast with being able to do that. I'd also strongly suggest having some sort of pre and post testing. Doesn't have to be anything really elaborate, but the pre-testing gives you kind of an idea of where they are coming into the game, and the post-testing gives you an idea of where they are ending the game when you finish training. And then lastly, training needs to be ongoing and not, we're done with that. We can go on to something else. You have to have a process in place by where you are continuously, kind of going through the education curve with your sales team. One thing I can tell you, and I don't care what you're selling. I don't care if you're selling real estate, medical devices, cars, yachts, IT platforms. I don't care what it is. Your salesperson's success and willingness to engage customers is going to be driven on their confidence in the product they're representing. And if they're not confident in it and they don't feel intelligent in it, they will hold back. because nobody likes looking stupid. And especially if you're talking to a surgeon, you really don't want to go in with anything other than a lot of confidence. So it is critical that their training and their understanding of what your product does and how it interfaces with that customer is very well defined and very well understood. Lastly, have realistic expectations of results. The budget you submitted to the investors may not be achievable by your sales team. There's the numbers you have to present to somebody to invest, and then there's the numbers the salesperson can actually achieve. They are not necessarily in alignment. And you need to understand that because it is in most cases, when you're going to an investor group or you're trying to receive commercialization, you don't have a sales team yet. You have no real world experience to draw upon. You're doing it based in a boardroom with other people, and you're kind of making your assumptions based on what you think the achievable market will be and what you think the accessible portion of it is for your product and what you anticipate the sales cycle to be and how readily the conversion rate will be. You're making a ton of assumptions. Well, guess what? Once you get into the marketplace, you realize those assumptions are almost always inflated. I won't say 100% of the time, but it's a number close to 100% of the time. What you come up with in the boardroom does not match what a salesperson will actually achieve. Benchmark results against peers. If you have more than one salesperson, absolutely look at their results against each other. Remember that every salesperson will say their market is different and harder. It's not. It's not. If I had $1 for every salesperson that told me, oh, you don't understand, Don, Miami's just different. Los Angeles is different. No, it's not. You're different, but the market's exactly the same. So be supportive, but have high standards. Establish milestones for achievement to measure salesperson performance prior to revenue. Here's another real critical one. Anybody here have a garden? Anybody have a garden? I have a garden. My wife's taught me to be a farmer. I go home and I farm. I water and weed and do all that stuff. But I will tell you, as much as I want to have a cultivated garden, I cannot go out there with a handful of seeds, throw it in the ground, and go, vegetables. It doesn't work that way, okay? So what I have to do is I have to go out and plant, I have to till the ground, make sure it's tilled up. I have to plant the stuff. I've got to water it. I've got to weed it. Guess what? I still do not have a garden yet. It's starting to happen, but there's all this pre-vegetable work that has to go in to get a harvest. Well, guess what? Purchase orders are the harvest. The purchase order is the harvest of your sales activity. So at Checkpoint, I measure a lot of stuff that goes into it. Before the purchase order, I mention actual in-person sales calls to customers. Sorry, brochure drops and voicemails and office manager visits don't count. My customer is a surgeon. Surgeons drive buying behavior. So yes, all those things may lead to a meeting with a surgeon, but I only count actual in-person, face-to-face communication with the surgeon as a sales call. Everything else is nice, everything else is wonderful, everything else doesn't count. Because no surgeon has ever converted behavior based on a brochure they found in their office and went, well, this looks compelling. I think I'm going to change my surgical procedure tomorrow. No offense, they just don't. But now they may call you tomorrow and ask to learn more, but you still have to get in front of them. I measure actual in-person sales calls to non-surgeons because guess what? There are a lot of influencers and there's a lot of stakeholders in a hospital. So I do want to know if you're talking to the OR director or the material manager. I want to know if you're talking to the scheduling nurse or the office manager. But I don't put the weight on it that I do a surgeon call. I measure covered cases. In our world, a covered case is the leading economic indicator to future economic growth. Because if my salespeople are covering cases, that means I've got a surgeon in the OR with my device. That means I've got a salesperson that was provided compelling messaging of our value proposition that made them want to try it. So that's the one I look at first and foremost. I measure luncheons, dinners, and other hosted events. You had to be interesting enough to have them go out with you. The days where somebody would just take a lunch as a free lunch are long gone. Their time is too valuable and they're too busy. So if you've got them to actually commit time to take your entertainment, they're interested on some level. We measure in-service presentations. Are you able to get the whole OR together to show them how your product works and educate them? Again, you have all these silent salespeople that are there that if you're able to get them engaged in understanding your product, your pathway to revenue is easier. And lastly, we measure value analysis committee submissions. How often are you driving that product into the hospital process for evaluation? So all those things are pre-revenue. So when I look at an individual salesperson that is yet to produce purchase order number 1, I can tell you if I think they're going to be successful. So going back to my farming analogy for just a minute, if you don't till, if you don't weed, if you don't water, if you don't do any of those things, why on earth would you expect a crop to just pop out of nowhere, right? But if you do those things, whether you may or may not get a crop, there may be some catastrophic event that wipes it out, but the likelihood is high that you will. So look for those pre-revenue assessments that you can look at for your sales team to say, are they doing the things I want to do? Don't just measure the crop. Measure all the things that lead up to the crop so that you can course correct as necessary if things aren't happening. Lastly, I will share this with you, and this doesn't make me the biggest hero in our department, obviously, but I'm a strong believer that replace the rep the minute you're convinced they can't get the job done. A wrong rep can set your company back a ton, and it's very difficult to overcome. And there are a lot of reasons why the right selection may lead to the wrong outcomes. People are, what do you call them? Real humans versus fake humans? But real humans have real issues. Real humans have marital problems. Real humans have drug issues. Real humans have children issues. Real humans have lots and lots of things that happen to us that cause us to be distracted from the work and maybe not be able to produce at the level that we need to. That's an unpleasant reality of life. But the reality of it is, in my opinion, if you've got all these warning signs that are coming up, the in-person calls aren't being made, cases aren't being covered, you're not getting into the VAC committees, all these things are happening, I think you're better to err on the side of removal than retention, because generally speaking, those things do not go away. Generally speaking, those problems do not disappear, they just get worse. So I tend to, I'm a guy that tends to be a little more, a little quicker, if you will, on the trigger if I'm convinced that I've got the wrong person in place. Again, I'm not saying the first time the guy's a bad day, you take somebody out. It's too expensive to replace them. But if you've got a lot of mounting evidence that the crop is not coming, you're better to make that change, whether it was a dependent or an independent, sooner rather than later.